I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways that each of us can make a difference. And as a nonprofit focused on educating and empowering people to get involved in climate action, we rely on the financial support of our listeners. So if you're a regular listener, or brand new for that matter, and you value what you get from us, consider a donation that aligns with that value.
All you have to do is head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the donate button. Even $5 a month goes a long way to helping us deliver our mission. But if you're short of cash and still want to help out, have your friends subscribe and rate us on your favorite streaming platform.
Yeah, great point. The reviews add up as well as the recommendations. So appreciate all our listeners doing that as well. And, you know, before we get into it, Thomas, welcome back from vacation.
Thank you, Jason.
Woo!
Yeah, it was great to spend a month on a bicycle.
We're excited you made it back in one piece.
Thanks, Jason. No, it was really good to take a bit of time off and smell the roses, so to speak, or the Doug firs.
So historically, when we've come on the show to talk about climate change and its worsening impacts, the dialogue tends to revolve around the government's failure to act. And while it's true that governments have been far too slow to respond, we don't often talk about the underlying reasons. The fossil fuel industry has been waging a decades-long coordinated campaign to delay climate action. They've spent billions of dollars lobbying the government and spreading disinformation. Their efforts have been multifaceted, from lying about the dangers of burning their products to trying to sow doubt about climate science. So today, we're going to explore the ways the industry has worked to delay action, the impact that has had, and as per usual, what we can do. Before we get to today's guest, let's talk about this week's reason for hope.
Yeah, thanks, Flora. So California has just filed a lawsuit against basically the entire fossil fuel industry. It's suing a number of major oil companies, including Exxon, Shell, and Chevron, for their decades-long deception about the dangers of fossil fuel burning. And the lawsuit seeks to create a fund that would help with recovery efforts following wildfires and storms that have been made worse by climate change.
Yeah, this is an exciting development. And, you know, it's worth calling out that California is also, joining a number of other states that have already, filed lawsuits against the fossil fuel companies, including New York and Massachusetts. And so there's just sort of this growing body of entities that are seeking damages and looking to hold them accountable for their disinformation. And while we're on the topic of California, also need to give them a shout out for passing a landmark climate bill that requires companies that make over $1 billion a year to publicly disclose their greenhouse gas emissions.
Wow.
Yeah, I think part of the reason this is so important is that, like, once California, makes these changes, like we look at what happens with emissions laws around vehicles, for example, in the Californian EPA, it then typically gets rolled out in other states and other jurisdictions globally. So them taking this stance at a state level is hopefully a big driver to get everybody else on board.
Yeah, I agree. And, hopefully it we can get some action at a national level in terms of these disclosures. Well, with that, let's get to today's guest. We're excited to have Kathy Mulvey from the Union of Concerned Scientists back on the podcast. Kathy has designed and led corporate accountability initiatives and campaigns since the late 80s. Today, she directs a climate corporate accountability campaign for the Union of Concerned Scientists, conducts research and analysis, builds coalitions, and mobilizes experts and supporters. Before her work at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Kathy was at the EIRIS Conflict Risk Network, where she worked with pension funds, university endowments, and others to support peace and stability in areas affected by genocide and mass atrocities.
And before that, Kathy worked with corporate accountability for 2 decades, serving as both executive director and international policy director.
Yeah, impressive resume for sure. And, obviously stoked to have her back on the show. Kathy, welcome back to Climate Optimists.
Thanks, Jason. It's great to be here again.
So Let's start you out with the question we do all our guests. When it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
Yeah, there's actually so much right now, which I think, in the face of worsening climate impacts might be a little bit surprising. But, we're seeing people mobilizing globally in a march to end fossil fuels that is timed to lead up to events of Climate Week in New York City and a UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit. So this is our organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, is one of more than 600 that are endorsing the march and really sending a strong message that we need to see stepped up climate action. And heading into that summit, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been increasingly really calling out that fossil fuels are incompatible with human survival, and calling on the fossil fuel industry to stop its influence peddling and legal threats that are designed to delay and obstruct progress.
It's good to hear the Secretary General, pushing so hard. He has some pretty impassioned um, talking points about what's going on, and certainly takes it very seriously. So, yeah, maybe we'll see something, exciting out of this upcoming summit.
Yeah, and for our work specifically to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for climate damages and deception, we're seeing real momentum with litigation that has been advanced by cities, counties, and states across the U.S. More than 40 jurisdictions at this point. Now, unfortunately, they have been delaying and tying up these cases in procedural fights for as much as 6 years for some of the earliest cases
Wow.
filed. And meanwhile, we've seen those impacts mount. So it's about time that communities get access to justice.
Well, hope for sort of a waterfall of reckoning here. We'll see what happens. Well, that's a good segue. I mean, let's talk a little bit about maybe if you can kind of lay out for folks how historically fossil fuel organizations have worked to kind of delay climate action, because this isn't a new phenomenon, right?
No, unfortunately, it isn't. It's really gone back more than 50 years that major fossil fuel companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, and others have been aware of the danger that their products pose to the global climate, and yet have not only not taken action to transform their own business models for a clean energy future, but have actually sought to prevent climate action, climate public policy. That ranges from spreading disinformation about climate science itself. And we documented this back in 2015 with our climate deception dossiers. This evidence from internal documents showed how they, sought to line up scientists who would deny the scientific consensus about climate change, how they sought to use political influence through setting up front groups and with misleading names and to interfere in policymaking. And evidence continues to come to light. I mean, just now we're reading in the Wall Street Journal about how ExxonMobil was seeking to cast doubt on the severity of climate change impacts, and its scientists supported research that questioned the findings of mainstream scientists. And it's a long-standing entrenched campaign, and even as the tactics evolve, it continues today.
Yeah, both frustrating and disturbing at the same time. Well, you've talked a little bit about sort of the approaches they're employing today. Are there other things that they're doing now? I mean, what kind of money is being thrown at this?
Yes. So, most of the major investor owned oil and gas companies now claim to be aligned with net zero global warming emissions by 2050. It's disinformation and greenwashing. For example, ExxonMobil again it has now disclosed the so-called Scope 3 emissions that come from burning its products, and these emissions amount to 80 to 90% of the total heat trapping emissions associated with their business. But ExxonMobil at the same time, refuses to take responsibility for decreasing those emissions, and so is making claims and pledges that relate to a tiny fraction of the overall climate impact of its business. Now, even Shell and BP, which acknowledge some responsibility for emissions from burning their products, have actually walked back climate pledges and targets this year. And we saw in 2022 astronomical, obscene profits really by the oil and gas industry in the wake of Russia's unjust war on Ukraine, and at a time when they actually could be expected to be investing in a transition to clean, renewable energy. They're actually doubling down on oil and gas, but trying to convince us that they're part of the solution.
Yeah, and just disturbing in the sense that, they've had all this runway to alter their business model, and that there are people within leadership in these companies that have children. It's like a head scratcher to me at a certain point of like, how do you continue down the same path? Well, sounds like ExxonMobil is one of the biggest culprits. Are there other organizations out there that are, a big part of the problem that may not be as familiar to folks?
Yeah, there absolutely are. So there have been new studies this year about Shell and how the company actually downplayed concerns about climate change from the 70s and 80s, even as it had this awareness of potentially devastating consequences. It really helped to um, shape publication and a narrative that emphasized scientific uncertainties and pushed for more fossil fuels. So that's an important piece of evidence that's come to light. And of course, the American Petroleum Institute has played an important role. It's all of the major oil and gas companies are part of this major trade association, and I know we've talked in the past about um, the infamous what we call the roadmap memo of the American Petroleum Institute from 1998 that said that victory would be achieved when average citizens understand or recognize the uncertainties in climate science. And the American Petroleum Institute continues its role in seeking to delay and block climate action today.
Wow. Well, I'm guessing it's hard to sort of say exactly how these things what impact they've had, right? Like, you know, correlation versus causation, but clearly have, had damaging impacts. I mean, does UCS have a sense of kind of where their lobbying and disinformation has really played out in terms of delaying things?
Well, I think one of the things that is very much on our minds now, looking ahead to the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change coming up later this year, is the presence that the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel industry lobbyists have had throughout that process, which is where the governments of the world come together to take actions and set the ambition that's needed to address this growing problem. And there's as you said, a correlation, at least, between the heavy presence of the fossil fuel industry in that global forum and the insufficient action that the U.S. and other governments have taken. And it's why people across the world are experiencing worsening climate impacts. And, of course, also those least responsible first and worst. So people of color, poor and indigenous people, and people in the global South.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm wondering, and maybe the answer is it's open to everybody, but how do these fossil fuel lobbyists continue to have a seat at the table at what is the major UN climate conference each year? Is that just because it's anyone can attend? Um,
Well, and in fact, I guess I left out one of the key points about this year's Conference of the Parties, COP28, is that the president of the Conference of the Parties is actually also the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And so, there have been real concerns there about the fox guarding the hen house in terms of climate policy, and a real conflict of interest between the objectives of the climate convention and the objectives of a major oil and gas company. And of course, here in the U.S., we've had an incredibly powerful and obstructive lobbying presence from the fossil fuel companies themselves, from industry-specific trade associations like the American Petroleum Institute.
Yeah, I guess that was one of my kind of next questions was how do elected officials, or even media organizations like News Corp fit into all of this? It sounds like the American Petroleum Institute, the oil companies themselves have access to, politicians' ears. How else is this all interconnected, I guess?
Yeah, in the US, of course, we had the Inflation Reduction Act passed last year, and we've celebrated the first anniversary of the adoption of that. And at the same time, we are seeing that it did allow for continued build out of fossil fuel infrastructure, and we're seeing fossil fuel corporations try to interfere in how that law is implemented in ways that would be favorable to business as usual. Another, and I don't know to what extent you've followed this or your listeners have, but many on the far right in the US are attacking environmental, social, and governance investing, so-called ESG investing, which has investors putting pressure on corporations like ExxonMobil and Shell has been one of the major forces out there, making them at least start to talk the talk of climate action, even though they're not
Right.
sufficiently walking the walk, right? And so, it's really alarming to see, and we've got the fossil fuel industry's fingerprints are all over these efforts, and so that's happening at the national level in terms of fighting against transparency, and it's also happening in various states around the country.
I'm sure before this interview, folks, have known that the fossil fuel companies have worked to obstruct, but maybe not the magnitude and depth of their obstruction, and maybe they're feeling discouraged at this point, thinking that they're everywhere. Let's maybe pivot to what kinds of tools, solutions are out there to counter this lobbying that continues to go on despite certainty in the science, despite the climate impacts getting worse in front of all of us.
Yeah, there is definitely a lot to be hopeful about, and a lot of ways that people can get involved. So by the time people are listening to this, the mobilizations across the country and around the world as part of the March to End Fossil Fuels will have happened. But we expect that there will be continued opportunities to get together, be visible, and mobilize in the lead up to the Conference of the Parties meeting at the end of the year to raise visibility of disinformation and greenwashing. As more and more we are seeing ads from oil and gas companies claiming to solve the problems of climate change with technological fixes that are unproven at scale, but
Right.
without actually addressing the root cause of the problem in their own fossil fuel products, right? So for people to use social media, use their local media to call out those attempts, amplify stories that come out in publications. Another really key way is holding these oil and gas companies accountable for the harms from their products and for their past and ongoing deception. So, I mentioned the climate litigation that's underway across the US. So, many people may be living in a state or a community that is already suing the fossil fuel industry over climate harms. It's an opportunity to let your public prosecutor know that you support that action and help to make that action visible. And I think, for us as the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're increasingly helping it to ensure that scientists recognize all the opportunities that they have to engage not only in public policy, but in research that may be relevant to climate accountability litigation. And just to say one great example is a study that some of my colleagues published earlier this year on the fossil fuels behind forest fires. This study found that nearly 40% of the area burned in the Western US and Canada since 1986 could be attributed to emissions from products and operations of the 88 largest carbon producing entities and companies. That study, which was published in May of this year, was already cited in a climate accountability complaint filed by Multnomah County in Oregon. So it's really important that we continue to build the evidence.
So you laid out a bunch of options for people to kind of get involved, and it sounds like obviously those in the scientific community have a particularly important role to play. And it sounds like that there is progress being made on the litigation front, which is exciting. I mean, I know there was a case that just happened in Montana. There's some success there where young plaintiffs sued the state. If people are interested, because there clearly are opportunities out there, where should they go? I mean, how do you find out if your local community is involved in climate litigation?
Yeah. Well, folks can definitely come to the Union of Concerned Scientists website. That's ucsusa.org. And we actually have a feature on the website called the Climate Action Button, which will give people options of actions that they can take. And our allies at the Center for Climate Integrity maintain a good website that shows that includes a map of climate accountability litigation across the U.S. and the world.
Great. Well, we'll publish those links with our show notes because I think it's important. I know even as we talk about this, obviously I was aware of the problem, but you still find yourself frustrated, and I think it's important that we don't sort of move to the next step, which is throwing up our hands and saying we can't do something, because there are clearly ways to get involved.
Absolutely. There are ways to get involved, and there are so many people who are being energized more and more and feeling compelled to join the climate movement. I think I said the last time we talked, I am definitely motivated and humbled too by the actions and the pressure from young people and from Indigenous people in particular who are justifiably not letting us rest until we figure out how to address this problem. And addressing this problem really means holding the fossil fuel companies in check.
Yeah. Well, Kathy, thanks again for, coming back and sharing some of your knowledge about this topic. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the space. Obviously, really critical. And good luck on that front and with these slew of climate litigation cases out there.
Thanks so much, Jason. Great to talk with you again.
So, great interview with Kathy. Not surprising. Before you guys weigh in, I just want to say I was frustrated and, found myself even angry at certain points hearing about, all the havoc that the fossil fuel industry has been wreaking. I was encouraged hearing about the legal progress that's being made. I mean, obviously, we just talked about the lawsuit being filed in California, but, seeing that some of this stuff is moving forward. And recently, while it wasn't a lawsuit specifically against the fossil fuel industry, the lawsuit where the plaintiffs won in Montana, there's lots to do. And yes, we need to, do more to address the fossil fuel companies and all the damage they're causing. But I was excited to hear about the legal progress.
Yeah, look, I think that the oil companies, definitely done their fair share at stalling this progress. I feel that this situation draws very similar parallels to what Toyota has been doing on the EV front, where for years they've been telling everybody that, hey, we've got some like 600-mile range EV that'll charge in 5 minutes like magic, and please don't go and buy an EV quite yet, right? Meanwhile, we'll keep selling you some crappy, internal combustion engine vehicle or hybrid or whatever that doesn't get the job done. Meanwhile, companies out there already are making really compelling solutions. And like I watched an interview with the head of ExxonMobil, and he was saying, oh, yeah, look, wind and solar, they're not quite there yet, which is absolute bollocks. But meanwhile, hey, we're going to have this like carbon capture and storage technology that's going to be amazing and will let us keep polluting forever. And it's like, dude, we know that it's like total greenwashing, that you're not anywhere near commercial scales with this. And who really wants to be sucking oil out of the ground and still burning it just to capture it again when we don't need to do that? Sorry, that's my rant for the day.
Yeah, and it's gone from, clearly this history where it was like climate change isn't real or it's not even going to be that bad, to now it's like, hey, we've got these solutions coming. And, by the way, fossil fuels are going to be this great way to transition, specifically natural gas. So, yeah, I mean, it's clear that you can't trust anything that they say at this point, and we should be eyes wide open about that.
No, true that. I was looking at some of the history piece that you're mentioning, Jason, and I feel like I'd read this before for classes, but every time I read it, I'm shocked. But I was reading specifically about Exxon, and in 1990, they hired two doctors, Fred Seitz and Dr. Fred Singer, to come and dispute the consensus on climate change science, climate change's effects, all that jazz. And both of them had previously worked for Big Tobacco and had been employed to question the negative effects of smoking. It all feels very sinister. And even further, even past that, I think 1997, 2 months before they had the Kyoto Climate Conference, Mobil, which, we all know ExxonMobil now. This was before they had joined with Exxon, put out an article in the New York Times that was called Reset the Alarm. Within it, one of the quotes is, "Let's face it, the science of climate change is too uncertain to mandate a plan of action that could plunge economies into turmoil." Yeah. No trust for these companies, seriously.
You know what gives me hope, though, is we look back at the Dieselgate scandal and the repercussions from that lawsuit against Volkswagen. And not only was that the catalyst of having to build out all these EV chargers across America and forcing Volkswagen to take the steps to, bring electric cars to market rather than just kicking that can down the road for years. But what it also did was put a whole bunch of executives responsible for this in prison. And that's what needs to happen.
Woo!
There needs to be some solid action. There need to be repercussions for the evilness that has occurred in the past.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the scale of damage that climate change has already had on,
Oh my
on the
gosh,
US,
yeah.
on countries around the world, it's staggering. And, had we not had fossil fuel pushing back against climate action, it would have happened decades ago. I have no doubt in my mind. And just for scale, as we're talking about the impact the fossil fuel companies still have, Open Secrets has this great report where they talk about fossil fuel industry's 2022 lobbying efforts, and they spent
Mm.
over $124 million. That's 1 year, $124 million.
Whoa. That's so interesting that was for 2022, because one of the facts that I found was about COP27, which was the conference in 2022, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Yes. And the article that I found was talking about just the amount of lobbyists, fossil fuel lobbyists, that were in attendance at the convention. Apparently, there were over 600 there, and they easily outnumbered indigenous groups that were in attendance.
Yeah. And it's totally understandable that, you'd feel frustrated hearing this news and maybe even a little disheartened. But I think it's essential that we use that for a catalyst for action rather than, throwing up our hands, because giving up is exactly what the fossil fuel companies want us to do. And, it's thanks to all these people out there that have been pushing back, like, the plaintiffs in these climate lawsuits,
Mm-hmm.
folks in the climate movement. That's what's driving change. And so, yeah, I think it's just worth calling out. We shouldn't be putting up the white flag with this. It should be a call to action.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. I think, like you've mentioned, just that Montana case is such a wonderful example where you have young people who are saying, no, like we have a right to live somewhere that's healthy for us. You're right. It definitely is a really wonderful thing to see how people are responding to the frustration and anger that comes from these things.
So before we pivot to the question of what can we do, just want to call out, because he's clearly a victim of fossil fuel propaganda, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in the UK and his efforts to try to roll back climate progress there. So relying on all our British listeners to do their part to push back on that. You read about his justification for it; it's just ludicrous. But it's all of us that, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or politicians, it's on us to hold them accountable. So, with that being said, there are obviously many ways to make a difference when it comes to addressing fossil fuel influence. The one we want to lead with today is calling on the Biden administration to declare a climate emergency. There's been pushes for this before. There's a big push underway right now. And the beauty of him doing that is it gives him special powers. It sounds like he's going to, be a magician here, but it would give him special powers to halt all U.S. fossil fuel exports, which could have massive benefits for the climate. It gives him the ability to halt billions of dollars that are flowing to fossil fuel investments abroad. So head over to whitehouse.gov and just submit can be just a 2-line comment telling him to declare that climate emergency and, the urgency of addressing climate change.
And if you need something, if you're feeling a little intimidated by those 2 lines and you need to dip your toe in the water first, we also have an option that you should take while you're on your way to then calling on Biden to declare a climate emergency, which is to call on Google to stop the spread of climate disinformation on their platforms. There was an investigation released this spring that found that 200 YouTube videos were spreading disinformation, and together those videos had over 70 million views. So please, please, please go sign the petition on the Union of Concerned Scientists website. And once you've done that, you can tackle those 2 lines.
Thanks, Flora. Yeah, the truth is you've spent now probably 30 minutes listening to us, which we think is a good investment of time. So just, it's really about taking those 2 or 3 more minutes to go send a quick comment to the White House. Like Flora said, warm up first, signing the petition, and we'll have, links, talking points, all that kind of stuff on our website if you need extra help. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks, as always, for tuning in. For those of you who want more emails they can look forward to in their inbox, don't forget to sign up for our monthly newsletter. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.